The dog would not leave the ashes, and that was the first sign that something still wanted to live. By the time Staff Sergeant Caleb Walker reached the old logging road outside Ashford, Oregon, the storm had thinned into a cold silver rain, the kind that softened the edges of the world but could not wash away the smell of smoke. A burned-out delivery truck sat crooked in the ditch, its front tires sunk into mud, its metal frame blackened and quiet beneath the dripping fir trees. The fire was gone now. Only steam lifted from the hood in pale ribbons, curling into the morning fog like breath from something too tired to speak. Deputy Aaron Mills had already waved off 2 tow trucks and half the volunteer crew. They had found no driver, no passenger, no clear explanation, just skid marks, shattered glass, and a vehicle that looked as if the night had swallowed it whole and spit it back empty. But 20 feet from the rear door stood Ranger, a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 with a sable coat soaked dark by rain and eyes the color of old amber. He was trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His paws were streaked with mud. His muzzle was dusted with gray ash. Every few seconds, he turned toward the truck bed and gave one low, broken sound. Not a bark, not a growl, something closer to a warning meant for one person only. Caleb stepped out of his Jeep slowly, boots sinking into the wet shoulder. He was 37, white, broad-shouldered, with close-cut brown hair and a face shaped by weather, service, and silence. He no longer wore the Marine uniform, but the way he moved still carried it. Measured, alert, careful with pain. Deputy Mills looked relieved and uneasy at the same time when he saw him. "Caleb, glad you came. Your dog is making this impossible." Caleb did not answer right away. He looked past the deputy, past the burned metal, past the yellow tape sagging in the rain. Ranger saw him and froze. For 1 second, the old K9's ears lifted. Then he lowered his head, walked through the mud, and stopped 3 feet away. In his mouth was something small and pink, darkened at the edges by soot. Caleb held out his hand. Ranger dropped it gently into his palm. A child's glove, the kind with a little stitched flower near the wrist, the kind sold in grocery stores before winter, the kind a parent buys because the mornings have started to bite. The world went quiet around Caleb. Even the rain seemed to soften. Mills exhaled hard. "We didn't see that." Caleb turned the glove over. It was damp, singed along one finger, but not destroyed. He crouched and let Ranger smell his hand, then the glove, then the air. The dog gave another low whine and looked back at the truck. Not at the road, not at the woods, at the truck. Caleb knew that look. He had seen it years before, half a world away, in a place of dust and hot wind. When a military working dog had refused to cross a doorway, no human thought mattered. Men had called it stubbornness. Minutes later, they called it something else. Since that day, Caleb had learned a simple rule that never left him. When a good dog refuses to move, the smartest man on earth should stop and listen. "Easy, buddy," Caleb whispered. "Show me." Ranger turned at once and padded back toward the ruined vehicle. One firefighter reached instinctively for the leash hanging from the K9's collar, but Caleb lifted a hand. "Don't pull him." The firefighter stopped. Ranger stepped through the puddles with careful purpose, passing the open driver's door, ignoring the broken windshield, ignoring the front seat where the fire had done most of its damage. He went to the rear corner of the truck and placed one paw on a warped strip of metal near the cargo door. Then he looked at Caleb. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but Caleb felt it land in his chest like a command. Mills frowned. "We already checked the back. Empty crates, melted plastic, nothing alive." Caleb moved closer. The smell was stronger there, not just smoke, but something sharper beneath it, like melted insulation and cold medicine spilled on metal. Rain tapped against the truck roof in uneven beats. Somewhere high in the pines, a raven called once and vanished into the fog. Caleb knelt, his knees pressing into mud, and studied the rear door. The latch was damaged, but not from the fire alone. There were scrape marks near the handle, fresh lines cut through soot, as if someone had tried to open it in a hurry or lock it before running. Ranger pressed his nose to the gap below the door and inhaled. Then he backed away and gave one sharp bark that made everyone flinch. Not loud, not aggressive, exact. Caleb looked at Mills. "Get me a pry bar." Mills hesitated. Caleb's eyes stayed on the door. "Now." The deputy jogged toward his cruiser. Ranger circled once. then stopped beside the rear tire, pawing at the mud. Caleb followed and saw it there, half buried under wet leaves and ash. A plastic wristwatch, small, purple, its cracked face still blinking faintly. On the band, written in silver marker, was one name. Emily. Caleb picked it up with 2 fingers. Rain ran down the back of his hand. Behind him, the crew had gone silent. Ranger stood between Caleb and the burned-out truck like a guard at a chapel door, soaked, shaking, unwilling to leave. Caleb closed his fist around the little watch and felt the old ache rise in him, the one that came whenever a signal arrived too late. But this time, the dog was still standing. This time, the ashes had not gone cold. And somewhere inside them, Caleb knew, was the reason Ranger had refused to walk away. Caleb kept the little purple watch in his palm as Deputy Mills returned with the pry bar, but for a moment he did not move. The rain slid down his jacket collar and gathered at the back of his neck, cold enough to make any man hurry. But Caleb had learned long ago that panic could ruin what patience might save. He looked at Ranger first. The German shepherd stood with his body angled toward the rear doors, one ear forward, one ear flicking toward the trees, as if the morning carried 2 stories at once and he was trying to separate them. His breathing came fast. His eyes never left the truck. Mills held out the pry bar. Caleb took it, then set one hand lightly against the burned metal. It was no longer hot, only damp and rough beneath his fingers. Ranger whined once, low in his throat. "I know," Caleb murmured. "I know." The sound of his own voice surprised him. It had gone softer than he meant it to, the way it used to when he spoke to scared young Marines before their first patrol, or to K-9 handlers who trusted their dogs more than they trusted luck. Caleb Walker was not a man people described as gentle. He was built like someone who had carried heavy things for a long time. 37 years old, white, 6 feet 2 inches, broad through the shoulders, with close-cut brown hair and gray-blue eyes that always seemed to be studying exits. He had left the Marine Corps 3 years earlier, but the Marine Corps had not entirely left him. It remained in the way he folded his grief into silence, in the way he checked doorways before entering rooms, in the way he heard a dog's warning before he heard a person's opinion. Ashford had given him space after he came home. It had given him a rented cabin near the tree line, work repairing engines at Miller's garage, and mornings quiet enough to hear the river under the bridge. What it had not given him was sleep. Some nights, Caleb woke with his hand reaching for a radio that was not there anymore. Some mornings, he caught himself counting men who were no longer walking behind him. The worst memory was not loud when it came. It never arrived with fire or shouting. It came as a doorway. A plain doorway in a sun-baked alley overseas. One Ranger had not even been there for. Back then, another K-9 named Bishop had stopped 5 feet short of that threshold and gone rigid. Caleb had been young enough to think time was something he could command. The team was exposed. The street was narrow. The order was to move. He had called Bishop forward, and Bishop had refused. Caleb still remembered the handler's face. He remembered saying, "We cannot stay here." He remembered the next few seconds only in pieces, dust rising, radios cutting in and out, a glove on the ground, a friend's voice that never finished its sentence. No one blamed Caleb officially. Reports were written. Medals were mentioned. Words like unavoidable and hostile environment were placed neatly where guilt could not be. But Caleb had heard Bishop before the blast. That was the truth that followed him home. A dog had known. A man had not listened. Ranger came into Caleb's life 2 years later, retired from search and rescue work after a leg injury that healed slower than expected. Most people saw an aging German shepherd with a silvering muzzle and a limp that showed when the weather turned cold. Caleb saw discipline, memory, a soul trained to notice what human beings stepped over. They had not become partners in any official way. There were no papers that made it sacred. Caleb had simply opened the door of his cabin one rainy October evening, and Ranger had walked inside as if he had been expected all along. Since then, the dog had slept near the front window, followed Caleb through town, and watched him during the bad nights without asking for explanations. Now, standing in the rain beside a burned truck and a child's broken watch, Caleb understood why his chest felt tight. The past had brought him back to another warning, another small signal, another chance to be either too late or finally faithful. Mills shifted beside him. "Caleb, what are you thinking?" Caleb slid the pry bar into the bent seam of the rear door. I am thinking he is not guarding the truck. The deputy swallowed. Then what is he guarding? Caleb looked down at Ranger. The dog's amber eyes reflected the gray sky, steady and pleading. Caleb pressed his weight into the bar. Metal groaned. Rain ran through the blackened seam. From inside the cargo bed came a faint clatter, something loose shifting where nothing should have moved. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, then turned his head toward the forest beyond the ditch. Caleb froze. There it was again, the feeling that the morning had split into two directions. One secret inside the truck, one trail leading away from it. He looked at the glove, the watch, the locked rear doors, and the dark trees drinking the rain. Then he said the words he wished he had said years ago. Nobody touches anything until the dog shows us where to look. The rear door opened only 6 inches before it caught against something inside, and the sound it made was not loud, but every person on that road seemed to hear it. A dry scrape, a hollow knock, something shifting in the dark cargo space behind the burned metal. Caleb held the pry bar still and waited. Rain ticked against the roof. Water dripped from the truck frame into the mud below. Ranger stood so close that his shoulder brushed Caleb's leg, and the old dog's breathing came in short, controlled bursts. Not panic. Focus. The kind that had been trained into him through years of rubble piles, storm searches, missing person calls, and long nights when the only difference between life and loss was a nose that did not quit. Deputy Mills raised his flashlight and aimed the beam through the narrow opening. The light caught melted plastic crates, a torn moving blanket, and the silver edge of a small medical cooler wedged against the inside wall. Its white surface was stained with smoke, but the lid was intact. Across the top, half covered by soot, Caleb could make out a blue sticker with a local clinic logo. Carter Pediatric Care. Under it, in block letters dulled by heat and rain, were the words emergency use only. Mills read it and went quiet. Caleb reached through the opening, but the cooler was pinned behind a warped metal shelf. He could not pull it free without widening the door. Ranger suddenly pressed forward, sniffing along the bottom seam, then backed away and pawed at the mud near the left rear tire again. Caleb followed the movement. At first, he saw only wet gravel and ash. Then his eyes caught a line that did not belong there. A faint streak in the mud, narrow and uneven, leading away from the truck toward the shoulder. Not a tire mark, not a boot print. Something had been dragged, or someone small had crawled. Caleb felt the little purple watch grow heavy in his pocket. Mills saw his face change. What is it? Caleb pointed. Light here. The deputy aimed his flashlight lower. The beam revealed 3 partial impressions in the mud, each no bigger than a child's palm, pressed into the softened earth between clumps of grass. No one spoke for a second. The road, the rain, the burned truck, all of it seemed to hold its breath. Mills looked toward the tree line. That could be from earlier. Could be anything. Caleb did not argue. He had learned that truth did not need to raise its voice. He knelt beside the marks, careful not to disturb them, and studied the direction. The impressions led away from the road, down a shallow slope toward a curtain of ferns and young Douglas firs. Beside one print lay a small bead shaped like a star, bright blue, nearly hidden in the mud. Caleb picked it up with the tip of his pocket knife and set it in his palm. A child's bracelet bead. Ranger sniffed it, then lifted his head at once. His ears locked forward. His body turned toward the woods. Caleb looked at Mills. Call search and rescue back. Mills had already reached for his radio, but his voice came out lower than before. All units. Possible missing child connected to the Ashford logging road scene. Return to location. We need a grid search started now. As the call went out, Caleb turned back to the truck. The cooler mattered. The trail mattered. But the order mattered more. A child had been here. A medical cooler had been left behind. The dog had guarded both. Caleb stepped to the rear door again and drove the pry bar into the seam. This time Mills helped, putting his shoulder near the frame while a firefighter braced the opposite side. Metal bent slowly, complaining under the pressure. Ranger barked once, not at them, but toward the woods, then back at the cooler, as if trying to hold 2 urgent truths in one body. The door finally opened wide enough for Caleb to climb halfway inside. The cargo bed smelled of rainwater, smoke, and the sterile sweetness of medical supplies. He kept his movements slow. The shelf had collapsed diagonally, trapping the cooler beneath it, but the lock was still closed. Caleb worked it loose inch by inch. The burned edges of the shelf scraped his sleeve. Somewhere behind him, Ranger whined, soft and thin, and Caleb whispered without looking back, "Almost there, buddy. Just hold on." When the cooler came free, it landed against his chest with surprising weight. He passed it to Mills, then climbed back down into the mud. The deputy wiped soot from the label with his thumb. There was a patient packet sealed in a plastic sleeve beneath the handle. The name was printed clearly enough for all of them to read. Emily Carter, age 8. Caleb felt every mile of the old war inside him go still. Mills opened the packet with trembling care. The first page listed a congenital heart condition, emergency medication instructions, and a warning written in red across the top. Must remain with child during travel. Ranger stepped forward and touched his nose to the cooler. Then he turned sharply toward the woods and let out a sound Caleb had never heard from him before, a high, aching cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. Caleb took the cooler from Mills. "The child is not in the truck," he said. Mills looked at the tree line, then at the prints in the mud. Caleb tightened his grip on the handle as Ranger started down the slope, slow at first, nose close to the ground, then faster as the scent caught hold. The rain grew heavier. The footprints were already fading, but the dog had found the part of the story the fire could not erase. Ranger moved through the trees as if he were reading a prayer written in mud. He did not run straight. He curved around broken branches, paused at wet stones, circled once near a fallen cedar, then pressed forward again with his nose low and his ears fixed ahead. Caleb followed 10 feet behind, carrying the medical cooler in one hand and a flashlight in the other, though the morning had brightened just enough to turn the forest silver. Deputy Mills came after him with 2 volunteers, their boots slipping on the soaked slope, their radios hissing with fragments of other voices. Search teams were on the way. A pediatric doctor was being contacted. Emily Carter's mother had not yet been found. Every new fact opened another dark room, and Caleb could feel the minutes gathering weight. The woods below the logging road were thick with sword ferns and young fir trees, the kind of place where sound disappeared quickly. Rain softened the ground but stole the trail as it fell. The small handprints from the road were gone now, washed thin into the earth, yet Ranger kept moving. Once he stopped beside a blackberry bush and gently lifted something from the thorns with his teeth. Caleb reached him and saw a torn piece of blue fabric, no bigger than a playing card, caught on the briars. It matched the color listed in the patient packet, blue winter jacket. White zipper, pink gloves. Caleb took the scrap and folded it into his palm. Mills looked at it, then looked away toward the trees. "She came this way." Caleb nodded, but he did not let himself imagine too much. Imagination could break a man before the truth had a chance to save anyone. He focused on the ground, on Ranger, on the cooler, on what could still be done. The packet said Emily had a congenital heart condition that made stress and cold dangerous. Her medication had to stay cool, but not frozen. It had to be given at the right time, in the right amount, by someone who knew what they were doing. Caleb was not a doctor. He knew how to stop bleeding, how to carry a man through smoke, how to listen to a dog when the world got loud. For the rest, he would need help to arrive before hope thinned out. Mills spoke into his radio again. "We have confirmed signs of a child moving east-southeast from the road. Possible medical emergency. Tell Dr. Brooks we have the medication container with us. Repeat, medication is with us." The radio crackled, then answered with a voice broken by static. "Dr. Helen Brooks is en route from Ashford Clinic. 15 minutes out." Caleb glanced at the sky. 15 minutes could be a lifetime in cold rain. Ranger suddenly stopped. His whole body changed. The search rhythm vanished, replaced by stillness. Caleb had seen that posture before, not when a dog had lost scent, but when scent had split. Ranger lifted his head and sniffed the air, then turned toward the left, where the slope dropped toward a drainage ravine hidden under ferns. Mills took one step that way, and mud gave beneath his boot. "Careful," Caleb said. "There is a washout." They eased down slowly, grabbing branches for balance. Water ran through the ravine in shallow sheets, carrying pine needles, ash, and brown foam toward a concrete culvert beneath the old road. The culvert mouth was half hidden by roots and storm debris, a dark oval cut into the earth, barely 4 feet high. Cold air breathed out of it. Ranger went to the entrance and froze. Then he lowered himself to the wet ground and crawled halfway inside, whining softly. Caleb crouched beside him. His flashlight beam trembled across the concrete walls. Inside were scratches in the mud, a small smear of blue fabric, and one white plastic bead shaped like a daisy. Mills swallowed hard. She went in there? Caleb did not answer. Ranger backed out suddenly, trotted to the cooler, touched it with his nose, then returned to the culvert. It was so deliberate that no one mistook it for confusion. The dog was not just tracking Emily anymore. He was connecting the child to what she needed. Caleb set the cooler down under a fir branch to shield it from the rain and opened the packet again. A photograph was clipped to the form, the kind used for school identification. A smiling girl with pale skin, light brown hair cut to her shoulders, and front teeth slightly uneven in a way that made the smile real. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, Emily Rose Carter, 8 years old, loves space stickers, hates peas, brave during shots. The words were ordinary. That made them harder to bear. A child was not a case number, not a missing person alert. She was space stickers and peas and a mother who had written brave because she needed the world to know her daughter tried. Ranger gave another soft cry from the culvert mouth. Caleb looked at Mills. We go in. Mills looked at the narrow opening, then at the volunteers. It may be unstable. Caleb zipped the patient packet back into the cooler and handed it to the deputy. Then we move slow. Nobody crowds the entrance. Keep that medicine dry, and keep Dr. Brooks on the radio. Ranger stepped into the darkness first. Caleb followed on his hands and knees, the concrete cold beneath his palms, rainwater soaking through his sleeves. The world narrowed to flashlight glare, dripping water, and Ranger's tail just ahead of him. 10 feet in, the sounds from outside faded. 20 feet in, Caleb smelled damp earth, rust, and something faint beneath it, a child's shampoo maybe, sweet, and almost gone. Ranger stopped at a bend where storm debris had piled against a cracked side opening. He pressed his muzzle to the gap and went perfectly still. Caleb leaned close, holding his breath. At first, there was only water. Then, through the concrete and rain and the pounding of his own heart, he heard it. A tiny voice, thin as thread, whispering one word into the dark. Mom. Caleb pressed one hand against the wet concrete and lowered his voice until it was barely louder than the water moving beneath him. Emily, my name is Caleb. I am right here. Ranger is here too. The darkness answered with a small, shaking breath. Then the voice came again, weaker than before. I want my mom. The words were so soft they seemed to break apart before reaching him. Caleb closed his eyes for half a second, not in prayer exactly, but in the quiet place where prayer usually begins. Outside the culvert, Deputy Mills called his name, but Caleb lifted one hand behind him to signal silence. Every loud sound in that narrow tunnel felt too heavy for the child hidden beyond the cracked side opening. Ranger lay flat with his muzzle pressed to the gap, his body still except for the slow rise and fall of his ribs. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He seemed to understand that now was not a moment for force. It was a moment for staying. Caleb turned his flashlight sideways so the beam would not shine straight into the opening. Through the broken concrete and tangled roots, he could see only pieces. A sleeve of blue fabric, one small shoe, pale fingers curled around a strip of plastic, and a face half-shadowed beneath a shelf of damp earth. Emily was wedged in a narrow service pocket beyond the culvert, a hollow left by old drainage work and hidden by years of roots. She must have crawled there after the crash, maybe following the sound of water, maybe hiding from fear itself. The space was too tight for Caleb's shoulders, too unstable for a hard pull. One wrong movement could bring the loose soil down and trap her farther from the light. Emily, can you hear me? He asked. A tiny nod shifted in the dark. Good. You are doing very well. I need you to keep looking at Ranger for me. He is the big shepherd right beside you. Ranger gave the softest whine, almost like a lullaby caught in his throat. Emily's fingers moved toward the sound. The dog stretched his neck as far as the opening allowed, and her fingertips brushed the fur along his muzzle. The change in her was small, but Caleb saw it. Her breathing slowed for 3 seconds. 3 seconds mattered. 3 seconds could be a bridge. Behind Caleb, Mills crawled closer, holding the radio low. Dr. Brooks is on the line. Caleb did not look back. Put her on speaker, quiet. Static crackled in the concrete tunnel. Then a woman's calm voice came through, steady and careful, the kind of voice that had learned not to scare frightened parents. This is Dr. Helen Brooks. Is Emily responsive? Caleb leaned closer to the gap. Responsive, cold, frightened, trapped in a narrow void off the culvert. Skin looks pale. Breathing shallow but present. We have the emergency medication cooler. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Is the medication intact? Mills opened the cooler behind him. Plastic clicked. Paper rustled. Yes, Mills whispered. Vials look intact. Cold pack still cool. Dr. Brooks exhaled softly. Listen to me carefully. Keep her calm and as warm as possible. Do not move her until we know the space is safe. If her breathing changes, tell me immediately. Caleb looked at Ranger. The dog was already doing what the doctor had asked before any human said it. He had pressed his body against the broken edge of the opening, offering warmth through the narrow gap, letting Emily keep her fingers buried in his wet fur. Caleb shrugged out of his jacket as best he could in the cramped tunnel and fed one sleeve through the opening. Emily, sweetheart, I am going to slide this toward you. Can you pull it close? The small hand trembled, then caught the fabric. Good girl, Caleb whispered. That is it. Just like that. For a moment, the whole world became tiny and exact. The jacket inching into darkness, the radio breathing static, Ranger's amber eye reflecting the flashlight, rain dripping from Caleb's hair onto his wrist. Then Emily spoke again. Is Ranger mad? The question pierced him in a way he did not expect. Caleb smiled, though she could barely see it. No, ma'am. He is worried. There is a difference. Her fingers tightened in the dog's fur. He found me. Yes, he did. Nobody else could see where you went, but he knew. The tunnel fell quiet again. Outside, distant voices gathered near the culvert entrance. Search and rescue had arrived, but Caleb kept his focus on the child and the dog. He could hear men setting equipment down, hear Mills relaying instructions, hear Dr. Brooks asking about dosage and timing. None of it felt real compared to the faint warmth of Emily's breath against the cold concrete. Then Ranger lifted his head suddenly. His ears sharpened. Caleb saw Emily's fingers loosen. Her breathing changed, not gone, but thinner, uneven, like a candle flame struggling behind glass. Caleb's stomach tightened. Dr. Brooks, her breathing just shifted. The radio answered at once. Stay with me. Is she able to speak? Caleb leaned close. Emily, can you say something for Ranger? No answer. Ranger gave one low sound, trembling, almost pleading. Caleb reached through the gap as far as he could, touching two fingers lightly to Emily's sleeve. Emily rose. Listen to me. You hold on to that dog. He did not leave the truck. He did not leave the ring. He is not leaving you. A faint breath came back. Then another. But the pause between them was longer now. Mills crawled forward with the cooler, his face pale in the flashlight glow. Dr. Brooks said we may need to bring the medication in before they widen the opening. Caleb looked at the gap, then at Ranger, then at the fragile space around Emily. The truth settled over him cold and clear. They had found her, but finding her was not enough. The thing Ranger had guarded in the ashes had to reach her before the dark took one more inch. Dr. Brooks' voice filled the narrow culvert with calm urgency, and Caleb held on to every word as if each one were a rung on a ladder. The medication has to reach her before extraction if her breathing continues to weaken. Do not force her position. Do not pull her through that gap. Caleb looked at the opening again. It was barely wide enough for his forearm and the sleeve of his jacket, and the soil around it was webbed with roots that looked strong until the water touched them. Above the concrete, rain kept falling, steady and patient, soaking through the hill, loosening what time had already cracked. Search and rescue workers gathered outside the culvert, but their tools sounded far away, careful clinks and muffled commands floating through the tunnel like voices from another life. Inside, the world was smaller than a heartbeat. Emily's fingers still clung weakly to Ranger's fur. Her face was turned toward him, pale and frightened, her lashes wet with mist from the cold air. Ranger had not moved except to breathe. His old injury must have been hurting in the damp, but he stayed pressed against the gap, giving the child the one thing no equipment could give fast enough. Presence. Mills crawled forward with the cooler, his elbows splashing through shallow water. I have the vial, he said, voice tight. Dr. Brooks is 2 minutes from the trailhead. She says paramedics are coming down behind her. Caleb nodded, but his eyes remained on Emily. 2 minutes was mercy if the world allowed it. 2 minutes was forever if it did not. Emily, he said gently, Dr. Brooks is coming. She knows exactly how to help you. You just keep your hand on Ranger." The child's lips moved. No sound came at first. Then a whisper. "Cold." Caleb swallowed. "I know, sweetheart. We are fixing that." He looked at the rescue lead crouched behind Mills, a stocky man named Warren with rain dripping from his helmet. "Can we widen this side opening enough for a medication pass?" Warren leaned in, shining his light along the cracked edge. "Maybe by hand. No power tools this close. Too much vibration. We move one root at a time, one piece at a time." Caleb looked back at the gap. "Then do it slow." Warren slid forward and began clearing the mud around the side pocket with a small hand trowel. Every scrape sounded too loud. Ranger's ears twitched, but he did not break contact. Emily stirred once, and Caleb immediately lowered his voice. "Stay with the dog. Listen to him breathe. In and out. That is all you have to do." Ranger seemed to understand. He took a slow breath, then another, deep and steady, as if teaching the child the rhythm by example. Caleb watched Emily try to match it. Her breath caught, thinned, then followed. 1, 2, 3. The smallest obedience. The bravest kind. Outside, hurried footsteps splashed near the culvert. Entrance, and a woman's voice called, "I am Dr. Brooks." "Where is she?" Mills backed just enough to make room as Helen Brooks entered on her knees, a compact medical kit strapped across her chest, her gray rain jacket streaked with mud. She was in her early 50s, white, with short blonde hair tucked beneath a hood and blue eyes sharpened by years of emergencies. She did not waste a word. She looked at Caleb, then at Ranger, then through the gap at Emily. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "there you are." Emily's eyes shifted toward the voice. Dr. Brooks reached for the vial Mills had opened, checked the label, checked the dose sheet, then prepared the medication with hands so steady Caleb felt something inside him unclench. But the gap was still too narrow. Warren cleared another handful of mud. A thin root snapped with a wet sound, and a crumble of soil slid down near Emily's shoulder. She flinched. Ranger instantly pressed his muzzle closer to her hand. Caleb felt his pulse hammer once. Everybody stopped. The tunnel froze. Loose dirt settled. Water dripped. Dr. Brooks waited, syringe protected in her palm. Caleb leaned close to the opening. "Emily, look at Ranger. Not at the dirt. Not at the dark. Just Ranger." The child's fingers moved again. Ranger gave a soft rumble, not a growl, more like a promise felt through fur. Warren whispered, "I can make a little more space from this lower edge. No upper pressure." Caleb nodded slowly. "Do it." The next minute stretched thin as wire. Warren worked by touch. Dr. Brooks counted Emily's breaths under her own. Mills held the light. Caleb held the child's attention with words that barely felt like words anymore. He told her Ranger liked scrambled eggs, even though that was only partly true. He told her the dog once stole half a blueberry muffin from his kitchen counter and then looked offended when caught. He told her that when this was over, Ranger owed her a proper hello in daylight. Emily's mouth moved at that, the smallest shadow of a smile, and Caleb felt the whole tunnel lean toward it. Then Warren eased one last piece of debris free. The gap opened by less than 3 inches, but it was enough. Dr. Brooks slid closer, guided by Caleb's flashlight and Ranger's stillness. "Emily, sweetheart, I am going to give you your medicine now. You may feel a tiny pinch, but Ranger is right there." Emily's eyes closed. Her hand tightened in the dog's fur. Dr. Brooks reached through with practiced care and delivered the medication. No one breathed for a moment. Not Mills. Not Warren. Not Caleb. Even the rain outside seemed to hold itself above the trees. Then Dr. Brooks withdrew her hand and watched Emily's face. "We wait," she whispered. Caleb stayed motionless, one palm against the concrete, his forehead nearly touching Ranger's shoulder. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Emily's breathing remained thin. Caleb felt the old doorway memory rising again, that terrible space between warning and consequence. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, not away from Emily, but toward Caleb, and in the dim flashlight glow his amber eyes held steady, refusing despair before anyone else had the strength to. Caleb nodded once, as if receiving an order. "Stay with her, Ranger." The dog lowered his head again, and in the cold mouth of the earth, a little girl's fingers found his fur and did not let go. For a long moment, nothing changed. Emily's hand stayed buried in Ranger's fur, her fingers pale against the wet sable coat, and Caleb watched her breathe the way a man watches a candle in an open window. One breath came shallow. The next came late. Dr. Brooks kept her eyes on the child's face, one hand resting near the opening, the other holding her medical kit close to the dry side of the culvert. Nobody spoke. Even Deputy Mills, who always seemed to have a question ready, stayed silent with his radio pressed against his chest. Rainwater slipped along the concrete floor and curled around Caleb's boots. Somewhere outside, more volunteers arrived, their voices softened by distance and fog. But inside the culvert, time had narrowed to Emily, Ranger, and the thin thread between them. Then Emily drew a breath that reached deeper than the others. It was not strong. It was not safe yet. But it was different. Dr. Brooks saw it first. Her shoulders lowered by half an inch. Good, she whispered. That is good. Caleb did not let himself smile yet. Hope was something he had learned to approach carefully, like a frightened animal. Emily's eyes fluttered, then opened a little wider. Ranger gave a soft exhale against her hand, and she moved her fingers as if making sure he was still real. Is he cold? She whispered. Caleb felt the question open something in the tunnel that no tool could touch. He is a little cold, he said, but he is more stubborn than cold. Emily blinked slowly. Me too. Dr. Brooks let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh and almost became a sob. Yes, sweetheart. You too. Warren, the rescue lead, shifted closer to the cracked side pocket, his helmet light sweeping over the roots and wet soil. The medicine had bought them time, but not freedom. The opening still held Emily in place, and the hillside above them had grown heavier with rain. Caleb could hear it now, the faint ticking of water working through dirt, the small settling sounds that only mattered when a child was beneath them. Warren spoke low. We can widen from the lower edge and slide a board under her shoulder. No rush, no pulling. We move the space around her, not her. Caleb nodded. Ranger stays where he is. Dr. Brooks agreed, without looking away from Emily. The dog is keeping her calm. Nobody moves the dog unless he chooses to move. Ranger seemed to understand the sentence, or maybe he had understood the need long before the rest of them did. He settled his weight more carefully, muzzle still close enough for Emily to touch, body braced against the cold concrete. Caleb positioned himself beside Warren, using both hands to clear loose mud from the lower lip of the opening. It was slow work, handful by handful, root by root, the kind of work that did not feel heroic to anyone watching, only necessary. Mud collected under Caleb's nails. Rainwater ran into his sleeves. His old shoulder ached. Still, he moved as gently as if he were opening a letter from someone who had waited years to be heard. Emily whimpered once when a small pebble rolled near her arm. Ranger lifted his head and gave a quiet huff, warm and steady. Caleb stopped at once. You are doing great, Emily. Just listen to Ranger. He is breathing slow for you. She tried again, matching the dog. In, out, in, out. The tunnel filled with that rhythm, fragile but present. Mills crawled backward to relay updates, then returned with a wool blanket sealed in a plastic rescue bag. Dr. Brooks guided Caleb as he worked one corner through the gap and tucked it as far around Emily as he could reach. Color had not fully returned to her cheeks, but her eyes looked more aware now. She kept staring at Ranger as though the rest of the world was too large to trust. After several careful minutes, Warren eased a flat rescue board through the widened lower space. Caleb held the roots back with one forearm while Dr. Brooks spoke to Emily in a voice meant for classrooms, bedtime stories, and emergency rooms at 3 in the morning. We are going to help you slide just a few inches, honey. Ranger is staying right here. Caleb is staying right here. Your medicine is working. You are not alone. Emily swallowed. My mom will be mad. The sentence nearly broke every adult in the culvert. Caleb shook his head gently. No, ma'am. Your mom is going to be thankful. Very thankful. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry out. Ranger touched his nose to her wrist. Warren counted softly. 1, 2, 3. They moved the board less than an inch. Then another inch. The soil held. The roots held. Emily gasped, and Caleb froze, but Dr. Brooks checked her quickly and nodded. Keep going. Outside, a voice called into the culvert. Dr. Brooks, we found Maggie Carter near mile marker 7. She is alive. She is being brought to Ashford General. She is asking for Emily. The words traveled through the tunnel like dawn entering a closed room. Emily heard her mother's name, and turned her face toward the sound. "Mama's okay," Caleb answered before anyone else could. "She is okay, sweetheart. She is asking for you." Emily's hand tightened in Ranger's fur with sudden strength. "I want to go home." Caleb felt his throat tighten, but his voice stayed steady. "Then let us get you there." The next pull was smoother. The board shifted. The opening gave. Ranger backed up one careful step, then another, never taking his eyes off Emily. Finally, Warren reached both arms through the widened space and guided her gently toward Dr. Brooks. Caleb supported the board from below. Mills held the light. Ranger stood trembling in the cold water, watching as the little girl emerged from the darkness wrapped in Caleb's jacket and the rescue blanket, her small hand still reaching for the dog. When she was free, the culvert did not erupt in cheers. It fell into something quieter, relief too deep for noise. Dr. Brooks checked Emily's breathing and gave one firm nod. "She is stable enough to move." Caleb bowed his head for 1 second, mud on his hands, rain in his hair, the old doorway inside him finally opening to something other than regret. Ranger stepped forward and rested his muzzle beside Emily's hand. She touched his nose and whispered, "You stayed." Ranger closed his eyes, and Caleb knew the answer even though the dog would never need words for it. Of course he had. The forest opened slowly as they carried Emily out of the culvert, and the rain that had felt so cold beneath the earth seemed softer in the open air. Searchlights glowed through the fog. Yellow jackets moved between the fir trees. A rescue blanket flashed silver around the child's shoulders as Warren and Dr. Brooks guided the board up the muddy slope with the care of people carrying something more fragile than a life, a promise that had almost been lost. Caleb walked beside them with one hand near the board and the other on Ranger's collar, not to restrain him, but to steady the old dog whose legs had begun to shake. Ranger kept his eyes on Emily. Every few steps, she turned her head beneath the blanket, searching for him, and every time she found him there, she breathed a little easier. No one hurried in a way that scared her. No one shouted. The whole hillside seemed to understand that rescue was not only getting someone out of danger. Sometimes rescue was teaching the heart it did not have to be afraid of the light. At the top of the slope, the burned truck still waited in the ditch like a dark question the morning had not finished asking. Its frame steamed under the rain. The rear doors hung open now, and the medical cooler sat on a folded tarp beside the road, protected by 2 paramedics who looked at it as if it were a sacred thing. Deputy Mills stood near his cruiser, speaking into the radio, his voice low and changed. He was no longer talking like a man managing a scene. He was talking like someone who had finally understood he had been standing at the edge of a miracle and nearly called it evidence. Dr. Brooks climbed into the ambulance with Emily, checked her pulse again, and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Caleb stayed outside the open doors, mud streaking his sleeves, smoke still clinging to his shirt. Ranger sat beside him, soaked to the bone, his ears no longer high but still pointed toward the girl. Emily lifted one small hand from the blanket. "Ranger?" Caleb glanced at the paramedic, then helped the dog place his front paws carefully on the ambulance step. Ranger stretched his neck forward. Emily touched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "You came back from the truck," she whispered. Caleb felt the words settle into him. He had not told her that part. Not fully. Maybe she remembered the dog in pieces, the warm fur near the dark, the soft breathing through the concrete, the way his presence had held the fear away. Or maybe some truths did not need to be explained to children. Maybe they recognized loyalty the same way dogs recognized a trail, by something older than words. Dr. Brooks looked at Caleb over Emily's shoulder. "Her color is improving. We are taking her to Ashford General. Her mother is already there." Caleb nodded. The relief should have loosened him, but something still held tight inside his ribs. He looked back at the truck, at the open cargo bed, at the blackened metal around the cooler's former place. The mystery had not ended with Emily's rescue. The truck had burned. The mother had been found miles away. The child had ended up in a drainage pocket with her medicine left behind. Too many pieces had landed in different places. But for now, the living came first. The answers could wait behind police tape. Emily could not. Mills approached as the ambulance crew prepared to leave. His face was pale beneath the brim of his hat, rainwater running down his cheeks like tears he had not chosen. "Caleb," he said quietly, "if you had not trusted him, we would have cleared the wreck and moved on." Caleb looked down at Ranger. The dog's muzzle was flecked with mud, his paws raw from the forest floor, his body sagging with exhaustion. He did not look heroic. He looked tired. He looked like an old working dog who had spent everything he had because somewhere in the smoke and rain, a child had needed him. Caleb rubbed the wet fur between his ears. "I know what happens when a man does not listen to a dog," he said. Mills did not ask what he meant. Maybe he heard enough in Caleb's voice to leave the old wound unopened. The ambulance doors began to close. Then Emily called out again, stronger this time. "Mr. Caleb?" He stepped closer. "Yes, ma'am. Can Ranger visit me?" Caleb looked at Ranger, then at Dr. Brooks. The doctor's mouth softened. "Once she is warm and stable, I think that can be arranged." Caleb looked back at Emily. "He would like that." Emily gave the smallest smile, tired but real. "Tell him I said thank you." Caleb looked at the dog. Ranger was staring at the child as if memorizing her face in case the world ever misplaced her again. "He heard you," Caleb said. The doors closed gently. The ambulance pulled away without sirens at first, rolling slow along the wet logging road, then turning toward town where the fog thinned between the trees. Ranger watched until the red lights disappeared. Only then did he lower himself into the mud with a long breath. Caleb knelt beside him at once, one hand under his chest. "Easy, buddy. You did good." Ranger leaned against him, heavy and warm despite the rain. Around them, the rescue crews continued their work, but their movements had changed. Men who had been rushing now stepped softly. Women who had been speaking into radios now paused before the burned truck with their eyes lowered. Not because of fear, because the place had become something else. A ditch beside an old road. A wreck in the rain. A dog that would not leave. Caleb rested his forehead briefly against Ranger's wet head, the same way he had done on nights when memory came too close. For years, he had carried one doorway inside him, one warning missed, one silence that followed. But that morning, beside the ashes, another memory began to take its place. A child's hand in a dog's fur. A breath returning. A name spoken from the dark and answered. The past did not disappear. Grace never worked that cheaply. But sometimes, Caleb thought, it gave a man one moment where listening mattered more than what he had failed to hear before. By the time Caleb and Ranger reached Ashford General, the rain had become a fine mist drifting across the hospital parking lot, turning every streetlight into a pale halo. The old German shepherd slept most of the ride in the back of Caleb's Jeep, wrapped in a wool rescue blanket, his head resting on the medical cooler as if even empty plastic still deserved protection. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, watching the rise and fall of Ranger's ribs. The town passed by in softened pieces. The closed hardware store, the diner with its neon coffee cup flickering in the window, the elementary school flag hanging damp and still against the gray morning. Everything looked ordinary, and that was what made it feel holy. Somewhere behind those windows, people were making toast, feeding cats, packing lunches, living inside the small mercy of not knowing how close one child had come to vanishing beneath the road. Caleb parked near the emergency entrance and opened the rear door gently. Ranger lifted his head before Caleb said a word. His body was tired, but his eyes were awake. "You sure?" Caleb asked. Ranger answered by standing, slowly, stiffly, with the dignity of an old soldier rising for roll call. Inside, the hospital smelled of antiseptic, coffee, wet coats, and warm air. A nurse at the desk started to object when she saw the dog, then stopped when Dr. Brooks stepped out from the pediatric wing and raised a hand. "He is with me," she said. Her voice left no room for paperwork. Caleb followed her down a quiet hallway where the floors shone under soft fluorescent light. Ranger's nails clicked gently with each step. He walked slower now, close to Caleb's left knee, but when they reached the room at the end, he moved ahead on his own. Emily Carter was awake beneath a pale blue blanket, a small pulse monitor clipped to her finger, her light brown hair brushed back from her face. Color had returned to her cheeks, faint but real, like dawn showing through a winter cloud. Beside the bed sat Maggie Carter, her mother, white, early 30s, with tired green eyes and bandages on one wrist from the accident. She looked as if she had aged years in one morning and then been handed them back one breath at a time. When she saw Ranger, her hand flew to her mouth. Emily turned her head and smiled. It was not big. It did not need to be. "Ranger," she whispered. The dog approached the bed with unusual care, as if the room itself had asked him to be gentle. Caleb helped him place his front paws on a low chair beside her. Emily reached out and touched the fur between his ears. Ranger closed his eyes. Maggie began to cry without sound. She leaned toward Caleb, trying to speak, but gratitude came too large for language. Caleb understood. Some words were smaller than what they carried. He only nodded and stood near the door, hands folded in front of him, feeling suddenly like he was intruding on something sacred. Emily looked at Ranger's gray muzzle, then at Caleb. Did he get hurt? Caleb shook his head softly. Just tired. He worked very hard today. Emily's fingers traced the damp fur at the side of Ranger's face. He was not scared in the tunnel. Caleb looked at the dog. Maybe he was. Brave does not always mean not scared. Sometimes it means staying anyway. Maggie reached for Caleb's hand then, gripping it with a mother's desperation and a mother's strength. They told me he would not leave the truck. They told me he guarded the medicine. Caleb swallowed. He guarded you both. Maggie looked down at her daughter, then back at Ranger, and her tears changed. They were still tears, but no longer only fear. They carried relief now. Wonder. The kind of sorrow that has found a place to rest. Later, Deputy Mills came by with his hat in both hands and explained what they had learned without turning the room into a courtroom. The truck had lost control during the storm after Maggie swerved to avoid debris on the road. Dazed and confused, she had walked the wrong direction looking for help, while Emily, frightened and cold, had crawled toward the culvert after seeing Ranger near the road. Ranger had been roaming the area after slipping out of Caleb's cabin during the thunder, drawn by smoke or instinct or something no report would ever name correctly. He had found the wreck, found the cooler, found the trail, and refused to leave the one place where all the clues still touched. No one called it a miracle out loud at first. People in hospitals were careful with that word. They had charts, explanations, emergency protocols, and signatures to collect. But when a nurse paused in the doorway and saw Emily asleep with one hand resting on Ranger's head, she made the sign of the cross so lightly that only Caleb noticed. Dr. Brooks stood beside him and looked into the room. That dog saved her life, she said. Caleb watched Ranger breathe, slow and deep beside the bed. No, he said quietly. He reminded us where to look. Afternoon came soft over Ashford. The clouds opened just enough for sunlight to touch the hospital windows. Caleb stepped outside for a moment while Ranger remained with Emily, finally asleep in the chair, his head near her blanket. The air smelled clean after the rain. Across the parking lot, puddles held pieces of sky. Caleb stood under the awning and let the quiet settle around him. For years, he had believed some failures could only echo, that a missed signal became a permanent room inside a man, locked and dark. But that morning had not erased the past. It had answered it differently. A dog had warned. This time, someone listened. A child had breathed again. This time, the door opened. When Caleb returned to the room, Emily was awake, whispering something to Ranger that no one else could hear. The old K9 lifted his tail once, barely, as if accepting a medal too private for ceremony. Maggie looked at Caleb from the bedside. Will you both come back tomorrow? Caleb glanced at Ranger, who opened one amber eye without lifting his head. For the first time in a long while, Caleb smiled without pain reaching it first. Yes, ma'am, he said. We will. Outside, the last of the rain slipped from the hospital roof in silver threads. Inside, a mother held her daughter's hand. A Marine stood quietly near the door, and a tired German shepherd slept like a guardian who had finally been relieved.